I know that death is an alarm clock without a snooze button. A morning you thought was going to give you a few extra minutes in bed with your lover or at the table with your kids, but instead it swept you away without warning, took you into the unknown without so much as a packed bag or a final goodbye. I know that some people leave, but it doesn't mean they're really gone. I know memories can last forever, even when the pain seems to run long. Hey, I'm Natasha T. Miller, and this is The Science of Grief. Trigger warning, today's episode is a heavy one. We're talking about suicide. If you're not in a space to hear this episode, please do something that helps you take care of your own mental health. Something I learned during this episode is the importance of language and the way that we talk about suicide. Abigail Waller, who you'll hear from later on, spoke to me about how we've moved away from the language of a person committing suicide, and we're now using terms like died by suicide or completed suicide. That also helps to decrease the stigma around the conversation of mental health and suicide. You'll hear me correct myself plenty of times throughout the episode, and that's fine. We kept that in here so that you all know that we're learning together. Today, you'll hear from Felicia Frabis. Felicia spoke with one of our producers, Kaylin Higgins, and shared her stories about losing her brother and also one of her cousins to suicide.
The beginning of May is both of my parents' birthdays. So that year, my mom was turning 50. What was the year? 2018. So it was my dad's birthday when we found out. So my mom and I were going to Target. We're at Target. It was probably like 7, 8 o'clock at night. And we were just getting last minute things for her trip because her and her best friend were going to Florida for her 50th birthday. And then it's just going to be like my dad and my brother and I at the house. So we were on the car ride home and my dad called my mom, automatically called her sobbing, you can hear it through the phone. And our first thought was, okay, it's our grandpa, or my dad's dad, because he had a couple health issues at the time. And we're like, oh no, it's grandpa or something like that. But something in the back of my mind told me oh, I should text David, because he lived in Virginia at the time with a girlfriend, and they were going through a really rough breakup at the time. So we were in communication a lot more, just checking in to see how he's doing and just talking a lot more. So something in the back of my mind just told me, oh, I should text David. So as we're speeding home, I was texting him, didn't get any response, but it was okay, normal. And then I found we came in the house and my dad was in my parents' bedroom, sobbing. And he told us David passed, David's dead. So at first we were just shocked. We're no, talked to him this morning, talked to him last night. He called that morning because we were out to brunch for my dad's birthday. And he called during brunch and we missed the call and then called right back. And talked to him, said happy birthday, we'll talk to you later, blah, blah, blah. And we were just, shocked. And we just automatically went to, calling his phone nonstop and texting him. We're no, it's not real. What, no. And my mom actually called the detective back because she didn't believe it. And my dad's he's not going to answer the phone. He's not going to answer. The detective just called me. When my dad first got the call, he goes, I thought he got into a dang motorcycle accident being on that motorcycle, but obviously it wasn't that. So we called the detective ourselves and my mom and I got the news of his passing. So it's just immediate shock, disbelief. We didn't want to think it was true.
I'm so sorry for that. I'm just taking that in. That just gave me chills. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I have tissue with me, so sorry if I...
Oh my goodness. So my question to you is, were there any signs?
No.
No?
No, nothing. And after his passing, I learned a lot more. My family as a whole learned a lot more about suicide itself and the signs and stuff like that. And we would go back and think oh, is there something I could have done? This and that. But we truly did not have any sign. Like, there was nothing that would have hinted at us saying something was up. Besides, like, obviously he was going through a rough time. He wasn't really happy living in Virginia. He, like, at the time, he, like, recently got out of the Navy, and he was working, like, a civilian status job, and he liked it, and he did well for himself, transitioning, like, out of the military, because he was able to retire after 10 years, right, from 18. So he was, like, 31 when he retired. So, like, that's already, like, an accomplishment itself. But, yeah, we really had no clue. I mean, he was going through a breakup, which we were kind of like, okay, like, it happens. And unfortunately, it was really serious with this girl. And there was just drama itself with the girl that I think our family kind of pinpointed a lot on.
So, after you got the news, what were you feeling afterwards?
So at first, when we first found out, like I said, it was like the shock and disbelief. Eventually, the sadness. Like, I remember my whole family came over that night. I think everyone stayed over till like 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, when we all just like sat around like crying, trying to like accept it all. So and there's just that initial sadness. After that, I think a lot of it turned into anger. Sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's fine. You have nothing to worry about.
And I think that's just for me. And I would say, like, probably my parents, too, because and my little brother, because we just didn't understand why. Mm-hmm. And that's something I've learned with grief and suicide. Like, you really will never know why. He left a note, and his note said, like, it wasn't, like, our fault or his upbringing or anything like that. It wasn't his parents' fault. It was just him. And he said he was, like, fighting stuff that we didn't know about. So I learned you really will never learn why, and you have to like get to a point where you stop searching. So I think a lot of it was anger for a while, because you immediately jump to like the relationship drama, and you want to pinpoint it on someone, like, you did this, when really I can't say if she was the sole reason, because I haven't had contact with her since it happened. Like, our family just didn't want anything to do with that. And sometimes, like, mentally, I think, and still to this day, I'm like, oh, no, he's fine. Like, he's in Virginia, because I wasn't with him, and he was in a different state. So I'm like, oh, no, it's fine. He's, like, doing his thing in Virginia. Like, it's all good. But obviously, like, it's not. And I think even still now, like, 2 going on 3 years later, it's still acceptance, but the grief just hits you on like random days, random times. Like, I think like the other day I had like a really vivid dream this morning. Yeah, it was this morning. I had like a really vivid dream, and I just had to like sit there and think about it because it felt so real. It's just like a normal, I think we were at like the mall or something like that, hanging out, and we're like, oh yeah, like that happened, but like it was a dream, but it felt so real, and it takes you back for a minute. So yeah.
Was your cousin different or similar to?
I would say it was different, but also similar.
Mm-hmm.
I think similarly, it was still the same shock and grief and emotions, but it was also kind of different because I guess I knew afterwards I experienced this before. I don't want to say I knew how to get through it, but I don't know. It just felt different and maybe because it was my cousin, not like my brother.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say in that sense it was different, but the feelings, I would say, and the like initial shock and grief were the same.
Just to paint a picture, your brother passed recently, and then months later, your cousin. And I know during that time, you're going through a really difficult time trying to process everything. You said you were like in denial, and you're trying to get a sense of everything, so to say. Do you feel like that after hearing about your cousin's passing, do you think it kind of pushed you back as far as like your grieving process?
I would say it pushed me back for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think it knocked me back into that initial grief where you're just crying and emotional. But then I think afterwards I just knew to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say it was like an initial setback.
So while you were grieving, how did you cope?
I didn't seek out professional help. I really just depended on my family a lot and my friends. But grieving was really different because the day after I found out that my brother passed, the next day was the first day of the spring-summer semester for school. And my parents and I were talking, we're like, you don't have to go. Like, it's okay. Like, I know you signed up for a class because you just want to stay on schedule, but, like, you do not have to go. And I don't know I know what told me to go, because my brother was always, like, put school as your number one priority. He had, like, a saying on his mask card he always said, and I couldn't find it, but it was, like, he always said, do everything the best you can. Don't shorthand yourself, because at the end of the day, if you shorthand it, you're only hurting yourself. And since school was a number one priority for us, something just told me, like, I have to go to class. Did I pay attention in class? No. Mentally, like, was I there? No. But physically, I was. So I really focused and put a lot of my energy into school that semester and then the fall semester after. And pretty soon, I felt like I had to be the strong one for my family. And since I was living at home that summer, I felt like it was hard for me to take time for myself to grieve because we were worried about my little brother. I was worried about my parents. And so I felt like it was really hard for me to grieve because I wanted to be the strong one for my family. So then at the end of that summer, I moved out again. I moved into my first apartment with one of my close friends, and we still live together now 3 years later. And she went through kind of like a similar experience, so I really depended on her a lot.
And I recently moved back home to my parents' house. So I guess being with them, especially around my dad's birthday, which was in May for his 3-year anniversary, being home and with my family and spending more time with them definitely made me appreciate them more and appreciate the support system that I have here.
So how is your family?
They're good. We really symbolize a lot in cardinals. And it's so funny because everywhere we go, we see one and we're like, oh, there's our boys. And because we would say it's for my cousin, my brother, and then my grandpa who passed in December. So every time we see one, or if it's like two chasing each other, we're like, oh, there's the boys. And I actually saw one last night. We were sitting outside talking and we just see a cardinal like fly through the backyard. Or for the holiday weekend, we were up north at my grandma's house and we were sitting having a bonfire and there goes another cardinal. We just take in like the little symbols like that.
But it wasn't until winter of 2019 semester where I had a internship with Care of Southeastern Michigan and Healthy Communities Beaumont and Grosse Pointe, where immediately right off the bat, they're like, we're planning a suicide prevention walk and like, we need your help on it. And automatically I had like a lead role in that. This is literally like written in the stars. Like this was like one of those like destiny moments to focus on something like that a year later. And the walk was actually the day before his 1-year anniversary. So I think working through that process actually helped my grief a lot more. Because I learned a lot more about suicide through the program because we partnered with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So I learned a lot more then. And then it allowed me to process my own grief in a healthy way besides avoiding it and just focusing on school and like whether it was, having a day where all I want to do is cry, like it was okay. Or just like finding other ways to channel that. And then I found myself like coming back more. I was hanging out with my friends more. I was more involved. I was more open to talking about this with my parents. Because like even before, before my brother passed, like we had no idea like or experience with like depression or anxiety or suicidal ideality. And then afterwards, we were definitely more comfortable with that conversation and we were more open.
So during that walk, can you tell us what were some thoughts that were going through your mind?
Yeah, I mean, the start of it, I think, was more high stress, getting everything ready, and it was in the back of my mind. But I think actually walking, and we were in Grosse Pointe, so we were on, the path was right on the water, and the water is just so calming and like very like serene. And we like, me and my siblings and I like grew up going up north. So like the lake and the water has always been a big thing for us. So I just think like walking and then like having like my whole family behind me and my friends really meant a lot. I remember thinking like, oh my God, he would be so proud of me right now. Or they both would be. And I remember my mom making like little buttons with their pictures on them. We got to wear them. So we had like little pictures of them on our shirts. And what something was really significant was with, because it was through the CARE put it on, but we partnered with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And what they do is they have a whole table of like just beads, but each color bead represents like a different meaning. So one color is like you yourself struggle with depression or suicide. You lost a family member, you lost a parent, you lost someone in the armed forces, like all these different ties to suicide. So seeing like everybody there with like different beads and like and the different meanings behind all of them, you really felt more connected to like complete strangers than you would think, because you are all going through the same thing without knowing each other's full story.
And for those that were wearing a bead who were like maybe struggling with suicide or depression, did you find that it was a lot of people with that particular color?
Yeah, a lot more than you would think. I think everybody, well, not everybody had that color bead on, but everybody had beads on of some sort.
So when you actually crossed the finish line, what did it do for you particularly?
For me, it symbolized support, I guess, like physically with my family being there, but also just mentally in my own self, that if I can pull something like this off on like the 1 year anniversary to the T, then I can get through anything. And I know that they both have me wherever they are.
For those who may be experiencing loved ones who either contemplating about suicide or has lost anyone from suicide, what would be like a message you would say to them?
I would say always just be available. Be the person that they can depend on and be a shoulder to cry on, and just always be able to listen. If I could like check in more, I would have. Again, like you'll never know like would that have had an effect or changed things, but if I just like sent like a text or a call like more often saying like, hey, like what's going on? Like you good? Like how you doing today? I think that's one thing I regret the most. So I would say just check in with them and check in with your friends and your family, because you really don't know what everyone's going through on the inside, even if it's someone you see every day. For people that just lost someone close to them, I would say there's always going to be like a hole in your heart. Like you feel like a part of you like also left with them, but you learn how to move on and you just want to do everything for that person. For me, like getting my degree being the first one to go to college. So putting like school first and getting my degree and focusing in public health and having a passion in mental health, it's everything for him. So I would say, like, you just have to keep going for them.
We just heard from Felicia Frabis, who shared stories of losing her brother and her cousin. She also talked about how her and her family learned to be more open to the conversation of mental health and suicide, and how she navigated her grief by doing things that her brother would have wanted her to do if he was still alive. I feel like it's important that we invite one of our experts to the show to talk about Felicia's story and talk about the importance of us all deciding to keep going after we've lost a loved one, especially to them completing suicide. To do this, I've invited Abigail Waller, expert, CAPS counselor at Michigan State University, bereaved parent, and friend of the podcast. Today's episode, is a little heavy. We're talking about Felicia and the suicide of her brother. Before we get into, any questions, can you just give us your thoughts on Felicia's story?
Yeah, I've got quite a few. I saw a number of strengths that came through, and maybe I can touch on those. The first thought I had is maybe just to start with talking about language. So, and how important language is and how language on this topic has changed. So we've moved away from using the term committed suicide. This phrase really evokes associations with committed a crime or committed a sin, and makes us think about something morally reprehensible or illegal. So the phrase committed suicide also ignores the fact that suicide is often the consequence of an unaddressed illness like depression and mental illness. So I just felt that was an important thing just to begin with. And the terms that we use more now, died by suicide, or sometimes you might hear completed suicide.
There's two sides to this coin, because we talk about, her brother dying, and we talk about, that being an unaddressed illness, something that's underlying. But also for Felicia, this was all very unexpected, where they talk about there were no signs. So I guess maybe just speaking to both sides of that coin, one being, if you are experiencing the signs, what could they look like? What could they be? But also on the person on the other end, how can you recognize that someone is experiencing these signs when they're not as present or in your face?
So that is not unusual. I have heard that a fair amount, especially working with families who've lost teenagers and young adults, that they report that there were no signs. They did not know that their child, young adult, was experiencing depression. And sometimes we see that in teenagers when something happens in their life and they act impulsively and, over a breakup with a boyfriend or girlfriend, and it feels at that moment in time the worst thing in their life. Remember, the primary goal of suicide is not to end your life, but it's to end pain at that moment in time. So on the other flip side, you're talking, there is typically an underlying mental health illness, but we don't always know it. So what does it look like when someone might be suicidal? It's, increase in depressive symptoms, withdrawing. Sometimes people talk about right before somebody acts on those thoughts is they might give away possessions. And people also talk about sometimes there's a decrease in depression right before suicide, because when they're really depressed, they can't act on those thoughts of not wanting to live and act on those thoughts of dying, the plan that they have. But sometimes if depression is lifted just a little bit, they could act on that. So sometimes you see that as well. But it's looking out for depressive symptoms and withdrawing.
One thing that I wanted to talk about is, do you feel like the grief over the loss of someone who has committed suicide, or not committed suicide, who has completed suicide? Do you feel like it's different from the grief that you experience when, you lose someone to something that is not suicide or suicide related?
Absolutely. So there are different pieces. So with a loss by suicide, I would call that a traumatic loss, traumatic grief. So there's trauma and there is grief. Grief generally is just a very messy process. But when there's more stigma, there is going to be potential of more trauma as well.
Do you have any advice on how people can process that trauma or deal with the trauma and the grief at the same time?
Yeah. Oh, I think the very first thing, the most powerful thing for just a griever is to be with other people who get it, whether that's joining a support group or seeking out other people who have lost loved ones by suicide. Although, my personal grief background is different. I have not experienced what I call a frontline loss. So it's a family member by suicide. I put my loss in the category of a traumatic loss, losing a young child. And for me, the most powerful, if I had my number one wish, it would be to bring my son back. But next thing that's helpful is being with other parents, people who get it, people who just can nod and say, I know, and I understand your pain. What we need to heal is, whether we're introverted or extroverted, we need connections. We need a really robust support system. And often, typically, we have to create that ourselves, whether that's a support group, going to a therapist, seeking out people that are helpful, and maybe putting a little boundary around people that aren't so helpful.
Yeah.
Grief there's elements of it that you learn to live with it forever. It doesn't mean the intensity of the emotions and those feelings are going to last forever. We kind of grow, hopefully, around the grief, and so we can hold it better. Someone described it to me as you become stronger. Imagine holding a big backpack, and you just become stronger, and you can hold it over time. So the intensity does diminish, but there are elements that go on forever. One of the things that comes to mind with death by suicide is that there's more stigma. And when there's more stigma, people get less support, as I mentioned. I think I saw some statistic that a loss by suicide, your support system is 50% less than another type of grief.
Wow.
So people withdraw when they don't know what to say. So that's really important to keep in mind, that when we lose someone by suicide, those individuals, their support system is going to be more fragile.
Absolutely.
And it's really important that the griever really works hard to stay connected with others. And if you're trying to help someone, it's really important not to downplay anything. What I mean by that is I think of sentences that start with, well, at least they had a good life, at least they're out of pain, at least. Those types of sentences are not helpful for a griever.
So if we were getting rid of the at least, do you have any tips or language that you can use to let somebody know that you hear them, you empathize with them,
Absolutely.
you're there for them?
One thing that I've heard grievers say over time, and I've definitely experienced it myself, not to pretend that you know what it's like. Not to say things like, I know how you feel. Unless you've walked in their shoes, you don't know what it's like to lose a child, a brother by suicide, brother by murder. You don't know what it's like, and it's okay. Tell me about that. What is that like? So it's also learning to sit with the intensity of those emotions and just helping someone hold it. That's really what therapists do. They hold the pain for people, and they don't rush in to fix.
Yes.
And, we live in a society where we want to fix things for people. We want to make it better. And with grief, we can't. We can't bring the person back. We can't make it better. But we can sit, and we as humans, we need witnesses. We need someone to witness what has happened to our life. And that is very powerful and healing.
Yeah, just seeing it, just listening to it.
In my situation, I had 2.5 years to prepare for my son's death, so I really wanted to do grief right, and my background being in the field of mental health. But grief there's elements of it that you learn to live with it forever. We kind of grow, hopefully, around the grief. And so we can hold it better. I mean, someone described it to me as you become stronger. Imagine holding a big backpack, and you just become stronger and you can hold it over time. So the intensity does diminish, but there are elements that go on forever. Yeah. Absolutely. So, the goal here is not necessarily acceptance or closure. We hear those words a lot in our language. But the goal is, it's learning to live with the grief. Learning to live with the grief with more love than pain.
Yeah.
I think that's...
I mean, I love the way that's put. Absolutely. I mean, the more you train, the more that you practice, the more skilled you become, the more the more stronger you become. That's kind of what we discussed on the last episode as well. So yeah, this is the backpack, and maybe the first day I couldn't hold it. Now the second day I can pick it up, and then it's 5 minutes, and it's 10 minutes at a time, and it's 20 minutes at a time, and I can live holding this backpack. We just learn to adjust and readjust as necessary, and we have the capabilities to do that. How do we become open to that process and see it as a positive, that these people are in some way still coming into our lives?
Absolutely. So you've touched on something really important that they now talk about in the grief literature, and it took me a while to wrap my head around it, but it's called continuing bond theory. Your relationship with the person continues despite their death. So in Felicia's story, how I understood it with the suicide prevention walk, her brother was helping her help other people. And that's how she continues her relationship with her brother at those suicide prevention walks and other activities that promote awareness about suicide. So that is continuing her bond with her brother. So it can come in different forms, whether it's on an anniversary, remembering someone, reflecting on their impact in your life. The relationship doesn't end just in their death. I mean, I guess my motivation of even talking to you is my son helping me help other people. I feel like as a griever, I learned this, what I call this tacit knowledge, this incredible knowledge that I couldn't gain from books about what it's like to lose someone that you love deeply.
Absolutely. I think that's important. That's the reason, for the Science of Grief podcast, coming from, my personal story, but then, from the experts to the people who are just here telling their stories, these young adults, they are helping other people. It becomes not less about you, but you might move out of the center a little bit. And now your center is, I'm going around and I'm helping other people, and that's also keeping me connected. If I had not been doing the work that I was doing, a lot of the relationship to my brother, I believe, would have slipped away. But by continuing to do this work and continuing to surround myself with other communities of people who have experienced losses or similar losses, it keeps me connected.
Yes.
And it makes me feel like I'm helping. So we know that suicide is the ultimate, right? It's like you talk about, it's traumatic. When you talk about, mental health, why do you think that that suicide or suicidal ideation goes undetected so often?
I think the stigma about talking about how we're doing. Think about when you bump into someone in the street. How are you? We're not really pausing, are we? I'm fine. I'm great. We don't really talk about it. Again, I'm reluctant to put positive things on tragic things. This is a tragic story. But what I did hear in Felicia's story is this positive that her family now talks about mental health, talks about depression. A lot of families, we don't. We're not given permission to. But, hopefully conversations like this will help destigmatize, and that people can say when someone says, how are you? Well, actually, I'm not great today. And that they have the confidence to know that most of us go through that. I think even, therapists panic when clients disclose suicidal thoughts. But there is a difference. I think often having what I call passive suicidal thoughts, when you're going through something really, really, really tough, is normal. But when it becomes something that we need to reach out and get help is when those thoughts become more pervasive, more chronic, and those thoughts it changes from passive suicidal thoughts to more active. that you have a plan, an intent, and that's when you absolutely need to reach out for help. You know, we live in a society where people can't say that they feel rubbish, they feel sad, they feel down. We want to always make it better for people. It's getting help, not panicking, getting them help, making sure they stay connected, you know, trusting your rapport with the person and honesty if that they're disclosing that.
How do we let them know that it's okay for that to not be a secret and something that you actually feel like you have to act on?
I think when we worry about someone's safety, we can't keep that confidentiality, that secrecy. We need to act on it and get them support. And ultimately, I think it's a relief if someone is disclosing that they're not feeling safe. I think they're disclosing it to get help.
After each episode, we try to give you a performance, something for you to sit with and reflect on. Today's performance comes from Cranbrook Christ Church Choir. Here's the song. This episode was produced by me, Natasha T. Miller, Shameen Sultana, Kaylin Higgins, our executive producer, David Lyons, and our editor, David Weinberg. Theme music by Jordan Davis with sound design and additional music by Sam Bobian. The last song you heard was Introit and Kyrie from Gabriel Fauré Requiem by Cranbrook Christ Church Choir, with additional production support from Patrick Vaughn, Holly Ann Stewart, Aaron Appleby, Maida Stange, and Antoine Scott. The Science of Grief podcast is a collaboration between Science Gallery Detroit and WDET, Detroit's NPR station, and is supported by the Children's Foundation of Michigan, MSU FCU, and Science Sandbox. Remember, if you are in emotional distress, reach out to someone you trust or call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That number, 1-800-273-8255. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of your mental health.